Hey, what's up, YouTube fans? What I wanted to talk about in this video, right, is how there are a few there are actually many good reasons for why even people who believe that there was a God involved with our creation, which I do not, but even many people who believe that there was a God involved with our creation agree that the way through which we were created was by means of common descent, right? All life descending from common ancestry, right? And there are a few good reasons, actually many good reasons for why people would be led to that conclusion regardless. One reason that I wanted to talk about in this video, right, is how, when it comes to, humans and other, mammals, right, the way that a human forms, right, we need the mother, we need to develop in the womb, right? A zygote will not just on its own develop into a human. It has to be in the it has to be in the womb of a mother, right? In the case of creationists, right, they will generally believe that the first humans were never even babies. They didn't have the same developmental process of any other human and were just created in full form, right? Which, by the way, part of what's funny that I've heard some people commenting on is how some of the famous paintings that have been done on the Adam and Eve characters from Genesis that, were believed to have been the first humans. What's funny is some of the famous paintings that have been done of them. I think that one of them was done by Leonardo da Vinci, if I'm not mistaken. What's funny is in the painting, it depicted them having belly buttons. And yet, if the story is how the Bible describes it, then they wouldn't even have had belly buttons, because the reason why regular humans have belly buttons is because it's a scar from our umbilical cord, right? But Adam and Eve were supposedly not created by means of how any other human is created. So they were never babies. They never were in the womb of a parent. They didn't have parents. That in some ways is like overcomplicating things, right? Because why create the first humans in a totally different way from how all the rest of humans are created? Why, if you already have genetic instructions for building the body parts, why separately build the body parts without using those genetic instructions for the first humans? In some ways, it's simpler to just, have a progenitor species that has, similar reproductive anatomy to humans, which would make sense since other mammals alive today do have similar reproductive anatomy to us. So just have a progenitor species, and so then the first humans would have been formed, they would have been created in the same way as all the humans we ever observe are. That, they would have been babies, developed in the womb, and so then you wouldn't have to have this separate strange way of making the first humans that's not the same as the rest of us. That in some ways will be simpler, right? And then if any of you are going to say oh, well, but doesn't that just push the question back further, because eventually it would have to lead back to the first progenitor species, that you would explain how you would have to have them made without those without developing in the womb or anything. But see, the thing is, if our ancestors have changed through the course of evolution over time, right, then we could eventually trace back to creatures which had differing bodies wherein they could be produced by their parents through alternative means, more similar to like a bird or lizard where they lay an egg, right? And then before that, eventually back to creatures like amphibians and fish where they have non-amniotic eggs. And then eventually back to creatures that are both capable of sexual and asexual reproduction, like sponges and flatworms, where they can even like reproduce just by means of splitting into two, and then as two organisms, or one grows on top of the other and splits off. And eventually back to like with sponges, how they don't even have any reproductive organs or any organs for that matter. And then back to single-celled organisms, right? And so then the anatomical body, like the features of our anatomy on the multicellular level, would never actually need to be themselves created independently from the genetic instructions for building those body parts. It could just simply every step of the way, like the first humans were made the same as how we observe humans in the here and now to be made. And by the way, what's funny with this, right, is so one of the creationist talking points they'll always repeat is they'll act like that their viewpoint is most consistent with what we observe, and they'll be like, we never observe a kind, quote unquote kind. They'll say we never observe a kind change into a new kind. And it's like, this is dumb for a few reasons. For one thing, kinds are not a biblical kinds are not a scientific concept. They're a biblical concept. The idea that differing living things are organized into so-called kinds, quote unquote, and they don't even have a clear definition of what constitutes a kind, or how do we tell which living things are in the same kind or not. Because yes, they'll say like, oh, well, if they can interbreed, then they're in the same kind. But most of them by this point will say that just because things no longer can interbreed doesn't mean that they aren't part of the same kind, because they could have, most creationists now even recognize that just because species are no longer capable of interbreeding doesn't mean their ancestors could not have originally been capable of interbreeding, and then through the course of their evolution, they wouldn't want to call it evolution, but through the course of their changing, became such that they no longer could interbreed. That's been demonstrated experimentally to be possible. And so what else is like dumb with this whole thing they'll say of like, oh, a kind can't change into a new kind, is that most creationists now, the major creationist organizations like Answers in Genesis, Creation Ministries International, Creation Institute for Creation Research, all of the major creationist organizations, or at least most of them, they now allow for speciation, that you can have evolution of new like the origination of new species from original species. And they even will tend to say now that everything within a taxonomic family, generally, that it can all be related. Groups often as much as hundreds of species. One of their talking points is to bring up finches and to say that Darwin, he showed that you could have variation of finches, but all the finches are still finches. But it's like finches, that's a group of hundreds of species. So they're already at the point where they're on board with saying that hundreds of species could already trace back to a common ancestor species. most if not all of the major creationist organizations now are on board with that, and in fact they specifically endorse that idea. It's important for that to be the case because it helps them with the Noah's Ark story and being able to fit all of the animals on the ark, right? Part of how they compensate for, how do we fit for all of these animals on the ark? Part of how they compensate for that is by saying that, generally everything within a taxonomic family can all be related. So it's not even just that they're like, oh, well, I guess maybe that's possible they could all be related. It's actually important to them that they should be all related because it helps with explaining their own story. And they even believe that they diversified within a shorter time span, much shorter time span than mainstream scientists do, because they would think that it happened within just a period of a few thousand years, whereas mainstream scientists would think it took millions of years, right? And that's already at the point of, to have like hundreds of species all traced back to a single common ancestor. That's enough that by many definitions, it could be considered by definition, not just evolution, but macroevolution, right? And they're already on board with that, right? And so, I mean, so the thing is, right, we never observe everything within even a taxonomic family, all be like tracing back to a common ancestor. We don't even observe that, right? And yet most major creationist organizations are already down with that, right? And so they already accept a larger extent of evolution than is observed, right? And so presumably they would understand then that like the fact that we don't actually observe, for example, all, dogs tracing, like all like dog species tracing back to a common ancestor, doesn't mean that, they didn't, because it was over a time scale beyond the extent that we could have observed it or, recorded it. And so if you could understand that even though we've never been able to observe everything within a taxonomic family all being related, that they still could, why would you think that we would have observed the extent of everything within a taxonomic order or like class or any of the higher levels? Obviously if we can't even observe it for the extent of taxonomic family, then we're not going to observe it for an even larger extent that would take an even longer amount of time, right? But they already acknowledge it for a larger extent than the extent that we observe, right? And the fundamental mechanisms we do observe, right? But so in any event, how all this connects with them, like saying that we never observe a kind change into a new kind, is that their view of how, humans and other mammals were created is actually what's inconsistent with what we observe in the here and now, right? The way that I believe that humans and other mammals were created is actually what's most consistent with what we observe in the here and now of how they are created, right? Developing in a womb, right? Whereas they, and like not fully formed adult, but we're baby, eventually adult, they believe that it was just, created full form in a type of way different from what we ever observe, right? And so that's another reason why it's hypocritical, this whole like thing of like them acting like that their view is what's most consistent with what we observe when it isn't, right? But so, okay, another reason I wanted to bring up as to why it would be most convenient to create the various species, the various groups of living things through means of common descent, right, is that all of the features like shared in common between closely related species, closely related groups, these features could be passed on via common descent, via common ancestry, right? And so, like in the case of humans and chimpanzees, most of our DNA is the same, right? Yes, there are differences, but we share most of the same DNA, right? And so, rather than like separately creating ours and theirs when it's mostly the same, you could just have a common ancestor, right? And then as the groups branch off, make changes along the way. And why this is especially convenient is because of how we observe a nested hierarchical organization of living things, right? We observe that living things are organized into groups where there's several shared features of the group, and then those groups are organized into higher groups, which are organized into higher groups, and so on. Like, for example, there's so many traits you have specifically because you're a mammal. The fact that you have 7 vertebrae in your neck, almost all mammals do, whereas we don't see that in birds, reptiles, or amphibians. But for whatever reason, almost all mammals have exactly 7 vertebrae in the neck. And we have heterodont teeth with incisors, canines, premolars, and molars. External ears is something we only see in mammals. The fact that we have a diaphragm, epiglottis, neocortex, a 4-chambered heart, hair, mammary glands, sweat glands, sebaceous glands, the fact that we have 3 middle ear bones, 1 lower jaw bone, the fact that we have a philtrum, which is the little indentation between the nose and the mouth, the fact that we don't have a cloaca, the fact that we give live birth, all of this is because we are mammals, right? It's all predictable based on the fact that we're mammals, specifically therian mammals, right? And I mean, I could do the same with tetrapods. There's so many traits you have because you're a tetrapod. There's so many traits you have because you're part of a group of primates called the catarrhines, right? Like dental formula 2123, 2123, downward facing nostrils, trichromatic vision, lack of grooming claw. Those are the major traits of catarrhines anatomically. You have all of those traits, right? We find that living things are nested into these nested hierarchical patterns, right? Where you'll have a group of all of these species where we can predict that something is part of the group based on one feature, and then like hair, and then based on that, we can predict so many other features, and then those groups are nested into higher groups, which are nested into higher groups. This is something we observe with life. There's great predictive explanatory power to the nested hierarchical organization of living things, right? And so that all the more then shows why it would be convenient then to create living things through means of common descent, right? Because for a group like mammals, right, rather than all these mammal traits being given to each of these groups separately from scratch, you can have a single ancestral mammal species, and then from that species, different groups branch off and inherit all the mammal traits. Same with the tetrapod traits, etc., right? And so that is yet another reason why it's most convenient for us to be created by means of common descent, right? And so, I mean, creationists, they will insist that their worldview is most consistent with what we observe. It's really not. We don't observe fully formed humans being made. That's not how humans are made, right? We go through a gradual process of growth and development. In our early stages, we need the womb. they don't even have any idea whatsoever for how we were created. They don't have a clear idea of what the physical structure would be of God. um they say like, oh, well, he's intelligent, quote unquote, but I mean, that's an ambiguous abstract concept. It's even more ambiguous in the context of God, because if he created everything and knows everything, why would he even need to be intelligent? He wouldn't need to learn or use reasoning like inductive reasoning, deductive reasoning, because he would already know all of the answers to everything, right? And so they're not, even in an abstract sense, they're not providing a mechanism or a model. They're just saying there was a thing that had the ability to make it happen and he made it happen. That's not an explanation. And it's debatable if we would even consider it a cause, because if he is spaceless and timeless and immaterial, not bound to any of the laws of nature, what do we even mean by cause by that point? Even the concept of causality by that point is ambiguous, right? So they don't at all whatsoever have a model. They just put the label of like, oh, it was God, we'll just call it that. But that doesn't explain it, right? That's not in of itself an explanation at all, right? All right, that's all for now. See you guys.